Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, have you been on the new Eglinton Crosstown LRT yet? Well, we have. And we're about to give you a tour of Ontario's newest light rail transit line across the middle of the capital city.
Surprise, surprise, Donald Trump is picking a fight with Ontario again, this time over the Gordie Howe Bridge connecting Windsor and Detroit.
Some shocking developments on the Toronto Police Service have prompted Queen's Park to step in. We'll tell you how the province plans to investigate potential police corruption.
And in your column, my column, I'm going to look at some of the politics around the Ontario Liberal leadership race.
And I am focused on one of the juiciest political stories ever to come out of Scarborough, Ontario, replete with betrayal, ambition, two levels of government, two political parties, and a lot of broken hearts.
It's Friday, February 13th, 2026, so let's get to it.
Okay, my friend JMM, a little sugar to start us out with.
As always, yes.
And a second sugar. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
How old are you now, darling?
I turned 45 on Monday.
45?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
I remember you when you were 44.
I was just a wee lad when I first came to TVO.
Good for you. 45 years old.
Yes, indeed. And I'm wearing one of my birthday presents, if I can get up here. This is a Star Wars joke on a T-shirt, the 5-day weather forecast for Alderaan.
You got to, okay, Sheldon, you got to put the camera on that again, because that takes some explaining, and it's really good.
Right. So the weather forecast for Alderaan, it's sunny, cloudy, sunny, exploding, and then Thursday and Friday the planet no longer exists.
Yeah.
Alderaan being the planet destroyed by the Empire in the movie Star Wars. So,
and we remember that was the first Star Wars episode, right?
Yes, for
episode 4,
yes.
Which is actually the first Star Wars movie, even though it's called Episode 4.
Yes,
A New Hope.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very clever.
It's a good T-shirt.
Yeah.
I've gotten to the point in my life where I'm kind of difficult to buy for because I don't need things. But we were walking through the mall and I saw this T-shirt on a rack and I was like, okay, this. I said to my wife, you can buy me this. This can be my birthday present.
This I need to have.
So,
well, I am doing one of my premier T-shirts today, not surprisingly, and the reason is 55 years ago yesterday, and I'm going to stand up now for those listening on podcast. You'll hear my voice get a little fainter for a little while. That's Bill Davis on the front of my T-shirt because 55 years ago yesterday, William Grenville Davis won the leadership of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party at Maple Leaf Gardens, if you can imagine, on the fourth ballot by 44 votes, very close, at 2 o'clock in the morning. He beat Alan Lawrence. This was one of the most historically interesting leadership contests ever, in part because this was the first attempt any political party made, this is 1971, remember, the first attempt to bring kind of mechanized or computerized voting into a convention. It wasn't fill out the ballots. They had actually purchased voting machines so that people could vote on machines. And there was a guy named Windy O'Neill. Doesn't that just sound like Chicago corruption to you?
Very much, yes.
Windy O'Neill was the guy whose company brought these machines in. And guess what? They did not work. They flamed out phenomenally. And what happened in the middle of the convention was they sent somebody down to Toronto City Hall, and with the old Gestetner machines, they had to run off a whole bunch of ballots and then run them back. So the convention was a disaster. They ran hours and hours behind schedule, which is why it ended at 2 a.m. There was a blizzard that night as well. And that is important to the story because Alan Lawrence, the guy who came second, was the mines minister. And a lot of his support was from Northern Ontario. And because of the blizzard, a lot of people from the north feared they were not going to be able to get the last bus out to get home to Northern Ontario. And so they left early. And by leaving early, Lawrence lost some key support. And as a result, Mr. Davis won on the fourth ballot. Remember, 44 vote difference is 23 people deciding to vote a different way.
That could have been the margin.
And that could have indeed been the margin. Like 23 people from Northern Ontario go home. There's Alan Lawrence's defeat right there. Yeah. Interesting that, the PC party always in history has usually a champion of the progressives and a champion of the conservatives. Yeah. And even though Bill Davis has this reputation today of being a very pink Tory, red Tory, pink Tory, whatever, he was the conservative in the race. Al Lawrence was the progressive in the race. And yet, as he won, and then went to the polls in October, won a big majority, and then through the 14 years he was premier, Mr. Davis really did change his governing style and his vision of what progressive conservatism meant. And he did become more progressive the longer he stayed in office. And, you know, he's the last guy to win 4 straight elections, 1971, 75, 77, and 81. And, of course, Doug Ford is going to go for the 4-peat whenever down the road. Yeah. So whatever magic formula Mr. Davis had figured out through his time in office, it worked, because he ended up being the second longest serving premier of all time. And it all started 55 years ago yesterday.
Now, of course, the picture on your shirt is not from the day he won office. It's from a bit later in his
much later.
tenure. Yeah. But, you know, I think one of our colleagues at the Star, Rob Benzie, has periodically phrased it as, you know, when he started school in kindergarten, Bill Davis was the education minister, and when he graduated high school or when he graduated university, Bill Davis was the premier, right? It was like...
He was around for 25 years.
Yeah, such an extraordinary career, and really, you know, shaped the province to an incredible degree. I would argue, certainly in my life, the only premier you could compare to somebody who had such a structural effect on the province is probably Mike Harris, who in 8 years obviously took the province in a very different direction than Davis did in terms of changing the institutions, changing the fiscal state of the province. Even Mike Harris, I think, would fairly say that his record would come second to Bill Davis's.
Bill Davis was the leader of the party when Mike Harris ran for the first time in 1981. And on Mike Harris's signs in North Bay, Ontario, in Nipissing Riding, it said, in the French neighborhoods, Équipe Davis.
Right.
In the Italian neighborhoods, on Mike Harris's signs, Squadra Davis, right? Team Davis.
Yes.
He ran as a Davis conservative. He became a little more conservative, but he would argue the times called for it. But
yes.
Anyway, that's another discussion for another time. Before we get to issue 1, let's just do a quick setup here, because we decided, when did we do this? A couple days ago. Yeah. We decided to get out of this studio and walk about 200 yards north, or should I say 175 meters north,
yes,
because that's where ground zero, if I can put it that way, of the new Eglinton Crosstown LRT, or Line 5, yep, as the Toronto Transit Commission calls it.
New with an asterisk.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's ground zero for it. And you and I have watched, as has everybody else in this neighborhood, with tremendous interest over the last 15 years, yep, as this thing, you know, either did or did not get built, or did or did not get open and missed, yep, deadlines over the course of many, many years. And so we decided to go for a spin on the LRT from here to Dawes Valley Station in the east.
Yes.
So how about we do that?
Let's, I guess, roll it.
Let's check it out. Here comes issue 1. It's a huge day. And you know this is a huge day.
Why is this a huge day?
This is a huge day because this will be, I don't know about for you, but for me, the very first time we're ever going to get on this Eglinton Crosstown, which we remember, you and I both,
yes,
the previous government announcing, how many years ago?
I guess the earliest announcements I remember covering were in 2010, so that's 16 years ago.
16 years ago.
Yes.
Should we go take a look and see what $12.7 billion buys you these days?
Back when Kathleen Wynne was not premier, she was the transportation minister. That's how long ago we've been talking about this.
Let's check it out.
Absolutely.
All right, let's go. They're calling it Line 5. They're not calling it the Eglinton Crosstown.
At least on the signage, they're calling it Line 5.
Yeah, as to be distinct from Line 1, which is Young University
Spadina. Yes.
Line 2, which is Bloor.
Yes. Line 3 used to be the Scarborough SRT, which no longer exists.
Right. Line 4 is Shepherd. So this is Line 5, and then Line 6 is Finch, right.
Yes, the Finch West LRT, which opened just a few weeks ago
right,
as well.
And is having a bit of a rough start.
Yes.
To put it
fair
mildly.
To say, it has not had a charmed beginning.
Now, I guess what distinguishes this from the subway is that part of it is underground. Oh, mine just so's the subway. Part of it's underground, part of it's overground.
Yes.
And this will be too. Where are we going, east or west?
We are going eastbound.
Okay.
I like the signage there. I don't actually love the layout of the map. I find this very confusing because it's not actually telling you the direction of the east-west, right? Like we're traveling.
It's opposite.
It's showing you the direction of travel, but that happens to me, in this case, it's flipped. So
it
is
Mount Dennis is west of here, but they've got it on the right end.
Yes.
Kennedy is east of here, and they've got it on the left end.
Yes.
Why would they do that?
Every other map of the TTC is north, south, east, west standard orientation. So the first time I took this train, I was momentarily confused, and then I've been irritated for days.
Well, I'll tell you what, the new trains are much quieter than the old trains.
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Let's get in. Well, we got to let the people off first because we're very courteous transit users, right? Let the people off the train first, please. Nice seats.
Yes.
You approve of the decor?
They haven't yet been spoiled by years of use. People of a certain age may remember that there was a previous Eglinton tunnel where the subway had started construction in the 1990s before that project was abandoned and the tunnel was filled in.
That's right. That was the Bob Ray government that started that one, and then Mike Harris came into power, decided we couldn't afford this, and filled in the hole.
Yes.
I also did notice the signs are bilingual. They are in English and in French, which is not the case on the other lines. So for whatever reason, they've decided that there are enough French-speaking people in and around Toronto that they should have all the information in both languages.
Well, and of course, Ontario does statutorily have a commitment to serving both English and French.
But you can see that they have not, I mean, the stations are clean and they're fine looking.
Yeah.
But they've not blown a lot of money on making them look really gorgeous, right? It's pretty...
spare, minimalist.
Yes.
Yes. Metrolinx was balancing a lot of different things, including trying to contain costs, which, this transit line did come in substantially over budget.
I heard something about that.
Yeah. Over budget and behind schedule. Here we are at the Dawes Valley Station.
We're at Dawes Valley Station, formerly the Ontario Science Centre.
Yes.
Very formally. So here we are.
Yes.
It's been 15 years.
Yes.
It's been more than, $12 billion?
Something like that, yes.
I mean, admittedly, we're in the first week.
Yes.
Early verdict? What are we thinking?
Well, the Crosstown has had a better opening than the Finch line did. The Finch line had a really rough start. But I think, if I can sort of zoom out for just a moment here and say, having covered the years of argument about whether and even how to build this line, people might remember the late Mayor Rob Ford, arguing vehemently against light rail transit. To see it actually open and operating, I'm not sure what the word is to describe it, but it just feels like something has finally completed. It's a real nifty feeling to actually be able to ride it, having covered so many of those opening arguments. And it seems to be running very well. Quite aside from my sort of nostalgia about the beginnings of my journalistic career, it actually seems to be operating very well. What are your thoughts?
The first thing I was thinking of, and you will appreciate and understand why my head goes here, I was thinking back to the 1950s.
Okay.
And I was thinking back to the time when Leslie Frost, who was the premier of the day, opened what was then the first subway line built in the city, which was Union Station to Eglinton. Yeah. It was the Young Line, and just a chunk of it, not all of obviously what it is today. And what a big deal that was when the premier got on that line and rang the bell and opened it up for everybody to go on. And in some of the coverage that I've seen of the opening of this Line 5, there has been some of that same kind of excitement and anticipation. There were people who actually camped out all night long in order to be the first people to ride on this new east-west line.
Like the opening of a new Star Wars film.
Yeah, I guess, something like that. So in that respect, it's kind of an exciting moment. TVO is right at Yonge and Eglinton.
Yes.
And this line is right at Yonge and Eglinton. So obviously, those of us, you and I, who have worked at TVO for a while, have been able to watch the progress or lack thereof of this thing for quite a long time. And I'm sure there were days when we thought to ourselves, this is never going to happen. This is never going to open.
Yes.
But finally it has.
Yes.
And here it is. And it looks pretty good. Could look a little better. They could do a little more color somewhere, but hopefully that will come along the way.
More zhuzh.
Yeah. But otherwise, okay.
Yeah. I think one other thing that I wanted to add was there's a very smart transit planner in the United States, a guy named Jarrett Walker, and he said, one of the important things about the Crosstown opening is that it's really the first line that we have built. the Shepherd line is maybe arguable, but it's the first line we built that is not focused about bringing people from the suburbs into the downtown core as a functionally like a line for people commuting into their downtown offices, right? This is a line that gets people from one end of the city to the other, and it reflects a city where increasingly the work is not just in the downtown, right? People are not just traveling from the suburbs into the downtown. They are going from everywhere to everywhere. And so the Crosstown, more than, frankly, even the Ontario line, reflects the ways that the city is changing. And that is an important thing to keep in mind as we hopefully ride it many more times in the future.
I think we have to ride it back to work now, shall we?
Yeah, I think we got to go back. And I got stuff waiting for me at my desk.
There we go. All right, let's go. Let's go back in time to when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister and decided we needed more bridge capacity between Windsor, Ontario and Detroit, Michigan. He asked the Obama administration for help in paying for that new bridge. The Obama administration said no. So Harper said, fine, we'll build it, we'll pay for it. And that's what happened. Now the bridge is about to open, and suddenly President Obama's successor is interested in what's going on with the Gordie Howe Bridge. Okay, Jim, and what is going on with the Gordie Howe Bridge?
Right. So earlier this week, via posts to his social media account, President Donald Trump threatened to block the opening of the Gordie Howe Bridge because it is a bridge that crosses an international border. The federal government in the U.S. has a role here in terms of licensing and permits. President Trump cited Canada's recent trade deal with China and then made some false claims about how much U.S. content was used to make the bridge, to build the bridge.
There actually was.
There was. He said that there was no American content. American steel, American labor was used to help not just build the bridge, but particularly Canada did not just pay for the bridge. We paid for the land acquisition on the U.S. side of the border, and we paid for the upgrades to the U.S. interstate system. We really did pay for the whole package here, which is why it cost $3.8 billion to do so. And separately from that, Ontario also paid to upgrade the 401 connection and extend it with what is now the Right Honourable Herb Gray Parkway in Windsor.
You should say a word about who Herb Gray was for those kids who don't know.
Longtime federal Liberal MP for the Windsor area, and he did pass away, and then the parkway was named in his honor. North of $5 billion had been paid to build this bridge and the associated infrastructure. And back in 2017, we will recall that President Trump was president back in 2017, and he was all for the bridge and not just being built, but opening promptly. People might remember the running joke of Infrastructure Week during the Trump presidency. There was a time when the Trump White House was very enthusiastic about this bridge, issued a joint statement with then Prime Minister Trudeau on the bridge's importance to trade, reading in part, "We affirm the importance of building on this existing strong foundation for trade and investment and further deepening our relationship with the common goal of strengthening the middle class." Things have changed.
You think? Yeah. So what's the president all riled up about anyway?
Well, so the whole reason for the bridge's existence is that Canada or Canadian policymakers have been nervous for a long time that this major trade artery, the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit and Windsor, is owned by a privately held company, which is owned by a family, the Maroon family of Michigan, of Detroit. That family, no fools they, have strongly opposed any publicly owned competing bridge being built that could make their own bridge less lucrative, right? They collect very substantial toll revenues from the Ambassador Bridge. And wouldn't you know it, according to the New York Times, reporting earlier this week, the owner of the Ambassador Bridge, Matthew Maroon, lobbied Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick about the bridge's opening shortly before Trump's eruption. The family has also mounted legal challenges in both U.S. and Canadian courts to try and stop this project, now going on for certainly more than a decade. There is, in fact, a court case in Ontario as we speak before the Superior Court about it's kind of a finicky interpretation of federal law about what privileges were granted to the company owning the Ambassador Bridge when it was created back, the company was created almost a century ago. that's a whole other thing. The case ought not stop the bridge from opening. The president could, in theory, but that said, Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke with Donald Trump after the social media posts. I'm sorry, I still cannot believe we are dealing with like national and international policy that is getting swayed by social media posts. But here we are.
This is the age in which we live.
Yes. So Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke with Trump about this and explained that while Canada paid for the whole thing, the state of Michigan owns half of the bridge. I assume that Carney also explained that once Canada has recouped its costs for the bridge, Michigan will in fact get half of the toll revenues. We are also we are not charging tolls on the American side of the bridge either. Like it's an incredibly
pretty good
sweet deal for the Americans, who again did not have to pay 1 red cent. Yes, hopefully that has been explained to the president, and hopefully that will dial things down.
Let me call a bit of an audible here, in as much as I'm always reminding myself when we do this show that we have a lot of younger people who watch and listen, and who may not know, as heretical as this sounds, they may not know why the bridge was named after Gordie Howe. Oh. And Gordie Howe, we should explain, was one of the greatest players in the history of the National Hockey League. The reason Wayne Gretzky wears 99 is because Gordie Howe wore number 9. So Wayne put 2 9s on his back to pay tribute to Gordie. Gordie Howe was from Canada originally, born in Floral, Saskatchewan, but of course played many decades for the Detroit Red Wings. So Stephen Harper, big hockey fan, decided to name it the Gordie Howe Bridge because Gordie Howe represents Canada, Gordie Howe represented Detroit. That's the background behind that.
Relevant to contemporary Canadian politics, Gordie Howe also was the one who gave us the phrase elbows up.
Yes, he was. His elbows were the sharpest in the game. There's no doubt about that. Anything else we have to know here before we move on?
Not directly related to the bridge, but something else happened in the U.S. Congress this week that is relevant to current U.S.-Canadian relations. There was a vote in the House of Representatives to end the declared state of emergency that Donald Trump used to justify part of the tariffs that he has imposed on Canadian goods. A small number of Republicans broke with their party's leadership to vote with the rest of the Democratic representatives.
But that's worth noting.
It is worth noting. Yeah. I don't think we have a ton of friends in the Republican Party here in Canada, but we do have some, at least.
6. We had 6 on that vote.
It turns out CNN pointed out that Canada is more popular than Donald Trump is among Americans right now, so maybe that helped us. Now, this vote on its own does not end the tariffs. The Senate would have to affirm this vote as well, and then, of course, the president can veto these kinds of motions. Historically, Congress has very often, you've seen votes where a much larger majority of congressional votes will assert their privilege to reverse a presidential veto. We have not seen that kind of behavior in the current Congress, so I'm not super optimistic. But it's a useful symbolic rebuke to the president.
Well, there is an expression in our business, John Michael. 1, 2, trend.
Yes.
1 was Marjorie Taylor Greene. Yep. 2 was Ross Douthat in the New York Times, both of whom have broken with Trump. Yes. And now here's number 3. A bunch of congressmen have broken with Trump on this issue as well. Yeah. The Republican Party is plenty, I know we're supposed to be onpoli, but as long as we're here, the Republican Party is plenty nervous about the upcoming midterms in November and the way the president's polling numbers are going into the dumper right now. There are a lot of seats at stake. So this is not necessarily a surprise.
And some of those seats are in the state of Michigan.
Hear, hear.
So just to bring us back to the bridge, the Michigan Republicans are absolutely aware of the potential damage this could do from. There is, in fact, an open seat that they are very interested in competing for. And this latest news is not helping their chances.
And Doug Ford got a little bit of the president's attention again this past week, did he not?
Oh, we're talking about the LCBO again. Yes, the part of these social media posts, the airing of grievances, the litany of Canadian sins that the president invoked included Ontario's refusal to stock American alcohol on the shelves. Once again, this seems to be an irritant that is playing an outsized role in the American consciousness. It got mentioned alongside like dairy supply management. The premier's position is the moment the tariffs are gone, the U.S. booze can be back on LCBO shelves. But so long as they're there, no Kentucky bourbon for Ontarians.
Well, you said Kentucky, and let me do one last follow-up on that, which is to say, Stephen Marsh, who's a very fine writer and journalist here in Toronto, he did a piece in the New York Times last Friday in which he pointed out that I think the production of Jim Beam in the South is down 85% in large measure, and of course people are being laid off, and that manufacturing is not happening in the way it used to, in large measure because the LCBO, one of the biggest alcohol purchasers in the world, has decided not to keep any more Tennessee whiskey or Kentucky bourbon on our shelves. So it's having an impact.
Yeah, it's absolutely getting people's attention, including the president. And, we were good customers for a very long time. There are Ontarians who would love to, buy these bottles again. Just drop the tariffs, man.
Be a good neighbor. There we go. And with that, we're off to issue 3. There have been some shocking developments on the law and justice file in Ontario over the past couple of weeks. Several current and former Toronto police officers have been charged with an array of serious offenses linked to organized crime, including drug trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, and bribery. Although the Premier was quick to dismiss those charged as, quote, just a few bad apples, someone has decided this is concerning enough to take further action. JMM. Who and what?
So the Inspector General of Policing is a kind of oversight officer created by a law the Ford government introduced back in 2019. The office itself wasn't actually created and staffed until 2023. Folks may remember a little thing called COVID-19 that got in the way of certain other priorities. And the office's actual powers only kicked in 2024. So this is still a relatively recently created office with new powers. Importantly, I want to just say the Inspector General is not an officer of the legislature. They are both hired and fired by the government. So that's different from like the Auditor General or the Ombudsman of Ontario. Those are officers who are named by the legislature and can only be dismissed by the legislature.
Meaning the opposition gets a say in their hiring.
Correct, yes. So that said, the Inspector General of Policing still has broad powers to investigate both police forces and the police service boards. Folks may not always be aware that we refer to like the Toronto Police Service, but the police who work in the city of Toronto are not municipal employees. They work for the Toronto Police Service, which is a provincially constituted body. The mayor has a seat on the board. Sometimes so do city councillors, but it's all provincially appointed. So a bit of a detail about police governance that I'm sure we'll go into in the future, but just worth emphasizing there. The Inspector General has the powers to investigate both police services and police service boards. And earlier this week, the current and still first ever Inspector General of Policing, Ryan Teschner, announced that he will be doing just that in the context of these very serious charges that have been announced.
Okay, let me make an analogy here just to set up this next question, which is to say, in Ottawa, the Prime Minister has a conflict commissioner who sort of keeps tabs on what he's doing. And it's the Prime Minister's appointment, which means that the opposition often says, you're letting the Prime Minister off the hook when he is in clear conflict on various things. This was a problem when Justin Trudeau was in power. He was found to be in conflict on some things, but not on others, which many people thought he ought to be. Yeah. Why do I ask this? Because when you're hired by the government or by the Prime Minister or Premier of the day, you may see your loyalty as being to them as opposed to the public good. Right. You've just told us this guy was not hired by the legislature. He was hired by the government of the day. So how worried should we be that his report is going to reflect the interests of the government as opposed to the entire legislature and or province?
So for now, Teschner has said, he told reporters at Queen's Park this week that his report will be made public and that his office will be working to make that report public as quickly as possible. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should expect a speedy report. And I'm not sure we would want something hastily done, let me put it that way. Teschner actually needs to appoint an inspector to run this investigation. That inspector has been, at least the shape of the investigation that Teschner has described this week is that it's not just going to look at the Toronto Police Service. He's actually going to take a very broad lens. He's going to look at all 45 police forces in Ontario. So that's the local municipal police forces as well as the OPP. And he is not intending to do a criminal investigation. He's not going to duplicate the criminal investigation that is underway in the GTA. That's not the purpose of his office or his powers. He is looking at structural, systematic questions of whether police forces have the systems in place to prevent these kinds of incidents before they take place. So, are there proper checks for new recruits? Are there safeguards to prevent internal corruption? These kinds of things, right? The Inspector General's office, as I mentioned, is still quite young, but they have issued a previous report taking a very wide look at Ontario policing that was specifically about the challenges around policing public protests and public disorder in Ontario's big cities. That report is public and is on their website. So if people want to see the kind of document that this office produces, that is so far the only example of the kind of document we might expect.
And if he finds something that needs doing, does he have the power to make it so?
Actually, this is interesting, right? Like I mentioned, the auditor and the ombudsman, their only powers are to make recommendations, and the government can take those recommendations or ignore them entirely. And you and I have discussed with the auditor's reports that, the auditor might make, 23 recommendations, and most of the time the government says, oh yes, we agree with these recommendations, we agree with these recommendations. And it's big news if the government disagrees with a recommendation. Then the question is always why, right? Teschner, or the Inspector General's office, does actually have the power to issue directions to both police service boards and police forces in any issues that breach the provincial law that we're talking about here, which is that's the Community Policing and Safety Act, I believe, 2019. So that's one big difference. Teschner does have the ability to make changes on his own. Now, of course, there is a criminal investigation underway. We are going to see how that proceeds. Just as a matter, we're always careful to emphasize that people are innocent until they are proven guilty. None of these charges have been proved in a court of law, but the way trials proceed, I'm sure we are going to learn more about these things. Some of those details could very well end up being shocking. Then Teschner's investigation will attack some of the same facts from a different direction. I think it's quite possible we would see not just obviously the resolution of a criminal investigation, probably years hence, not just Teschner's report, but the government may feel the need to introduce new legislation as well.
Gotcha. And with that, we're off to your column, my column. All right, it's time now for our regular feature. We call it Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the stuff we wrote for TVO.org this past week. You can always go online, find our columns. We hope that we titillate you a little bit by discussing these columns, and that you'll go and actually read them. And normally I start with you, but I think this week I'm going to go first, if
Absolutely.
That's okay. Because the juiciest political story of the year is taking place in the southwest end of Scarborough, Ontario right now, and we got to talk about it.
Yeah. It started while you were away.
It happened when I was away, I know. Why does the best stuff happen when I'm away? But anyway, we're catching up to it here. And of course, the story is going to go on for many, many more months.
Yes.
So let me set it up. If you've been following this, you will know that the deputy leader of the New Democratic Party of Ontario, a woman named Dolly Begum, who was the first ever Bangladeshi Canadian elected at any legislature in the country, first ever. So as a person of some historic significance to that community, she decided that she wanted to quit the Ontario legislature as an MPP, and because there is a vacancy federally in the same riding, she wants to run federally. Not necessarily any news there, because that happens all the time where people at the province, at the provincial levels, see a vacancy federally, and they may want to, as they say, move up to a different level of government, which happens to pay twice as much as well. However, she switched parties,
yes.
And that's what makes this interesting. She is running for the Liberals federally, for Mark Carney's government. They kind of poached her.
Yes.
And they have appointed her to the seat, so there'll be no nomination. She's the nominated candidate.
Yeah.
that started a series of events where the federal Liberal MP for Beaches East York, Nathaniel Erskine Smith, says he now is going to contest the provincial by-election for Scarborough Southwest. That's not his riding federally, obviously, but he's right next door in Beaches East York. So he thinks, well, I'm just going to move across the border, so to speak, and I'm going to run there, and I'm going to plant my flag there, hopefully win that by-election from which to launch my leadership campaign, because he wants to become the next leader of the Ontario Liberals. What's happened here? Dolly Begum has really broken the hearts of a lot of New Democrats. Yes. And I give Marit Stiles, the opposition leader of the NDP, a lot of props for keeping her cool. She put out a press release saying, we thank her for her service to Ontario. We wish her well in her future endeavors. But then in the press conference that was held later, she did say, there are a lot of broken hearts in New Democrat neighborhoods in Scarborough Southwest because, crossing the floor is still a big deal. She hasn't crossed the floor from the same legislature, but she switched parties to go to another one. Now, suddenly, the Liberals have a decision. So the day one story was the NDP. The day two story is now, what are the Liberals going to do? Yeah. Are they going to have a nomination meeting in Scarborough Southwest, or are they just going to appoint Nate Erskine Smith as their candidate to run in that by-election? It gets tricky because the candidate who ran for the Liberals in the last provincial election says, I want another shot at this. She didn't do very well when she ran last time. In fact, she ran 7 points behind the party province-wide. So the Liberals might be thinking to themselves right now, we don't really owe you a second shot. You didn't do all that well last time, and we got a bit of a star here in Erskine Smith who we could just parachute in there. This could get a lot messier before it gets cleaned up, but the reality is internecine warfare, crossing the floor, multiple parties, multiple levels of government, ambition, broken hearts, it's all there. So I like this story.
Yeah, so I also wrote about some of these events last week, and so I'm just going to continue riffing on this if we can. We also learned that the Liberal Party has announced what the rough rules for their leadership contest. They will vote up to November 20th. The winner of the leadership contest will be announced on November 21st.
What kind of conventions are going to be, JMM?
It's not going to be a delegated convention. It's going to be ranked ballots.
Right here, folks, right here. Bill Davis, 4 ballots, 1971 delegated convention. Exciting. Ended at 2 o'clock in the morning. We just don't do delegated conventions anymore.
No, I suspect we're not going to.
And I watched last week when you were on with your 2 colleagues, and you talked about delegated convention. And thank you for giving me the shout out when you said, I know Steve's going to be very unhappy to hear this is not going to be a delegated convention, but they just don't listen.
So, one of the issues that Liberals were debating was how long should this contest be? There were many voices. I would say, I think I can fairly say many of them were people supporting Nate Erskine Smith who wanted a quick contest. They believe that would be to his advantage. But there was also, I think, a principle here that a longer contest was going to interfere with the municipal elections that are coming in the fall. It had already been several months since Bonnie Crombie announced her resignation, and the party was just burning time. I know many of them were quite public that a November contest they see as being somewhat ridiculous, if I can put it gently. As one person put it on social media, on the day that the rules were announced, which was last weekend, last Saturday or Sunday, there were children not yet conceived who will be born before November 21st. And I went and did the math on what the average term of a pregnancy is, and that checks out.
It's a bit of a long runway then till the next convention.
Yeah. So, I mean, it will have been more than a year since Bonnie Crombie's not quite victory in that leadership vote.
Review. Yeah.
So, it's going to be a long contest that has upset some people. The other thing I will say is that I think some people are being very weird about Erskine Smith's candidacy. The idea that he would run for this provincial by-election, people are screaming about it's just. I think you used the phrase in your piece about the criticism of him is that it's all about him.
It's all about me, yeah.
And I first of all, I'm sorry, are people scandalized by ambition in politics, right? And secondly, the Ontario Liberal Party is they're doing better right now than they have for much of the last decade, but they're still not doing so fantastically well in provincial politics that they can afford to be choosy about who wants to run under their banner. And so I would not recommend that they just appoint Erskine Smith to be the candidate, but he says he wants to run, so make it a contested nomination, and like that would also be a good sort of beta test for Erskine Smith's politics, right?
There's no question that you have added legitimacy if you subject yourself to a nomination meeting and you win the nomination. Yeah. I have heard from many politicians in the past where if somebody gets appointed to a nomination and then wins in the by-election or general election, the first time they walk into that caucus meeting, there are other MPs who look at them and said, geez, I had to run for my nomination to get here, and you didn't. And that is a bit of an irritant among many people.
Yes.
Having said that, I note the federal Liberals, I guess in the past week or two, have appointed Dr. Danielle Martin to the University of Rosedale Liberal nomination. Yes. There will not be a contested nomination there. So, you know, they make their judgments and they live with the consequences here. She's a fine candidate, immensely bright, has a lot to bring to public life, and they didn't want to take the chance that she might lose a nomination. Yes. Okay, fair enough. I'll tell you what, I think with the advice of the Liberal executive, I think this is John Fraser's call. He's the interim leader, and he can decide whether it will be a contested nomination or whether he wants to assume the right of appointment, which he can do. And so all eyes on the Liberals for the next little while till they figure that out.
I did ask Fraser's office this week if there was going to be any decision announced before we started taping.
Right.
As of now, I have not heard back. The last time I asked last week, no decision had been made. So yes, so we're waiting on any decision in Scarborough Southwest about whether to name a nominee or whether to have a contested nomination. We then will watch as various candidates make their kind of quasi-unofficial campaigns more official. Erskine Smith, not the only one by any means. We've mentioned Andrew Bozzari on the podcast as one potential leadership candidate. He has taken his name out of contention, said he will not be running. So candidates have until July 31st to submit all of their nomination papers and I guess file the initial entry fee. And then as we say, members will be using weighted ranked ballots to choose the next leader. The other thing to note is that one of the requests from some of the party grassroots was that they wanted an electronic option to vote this time around. The party has said they will do that. So that will be, I believe, slightly different from the last time when it was still ranked ballots, but I believe it was all paper ballots.
So Danielle Martin was considering a run for the provincial Liberal leadership. She's now going to run federally. Yeah. Andrew Bozzari was considering a run for the provincial Liberal leadership. He's now taken himself out.
Yes.
Yvonne Baker, who's a member of Parliament from Etobicoke for the Liberals.
And former MPP.
And former MPP as well. That's right. Yeah. He has also taken himself out of the provincial Liberal leadership. Yeah. So at the moment, we have more people making announcements that they're not running than who are running, which is not necessarily a good sign. But anyway, that is the way things are.
Etobicoke MPP Lee Faircloth has not officially said she is running, but she has started collecting names.
Yeah,
so yeah,
she is. Okay, shall we do the mailbag?
Yes, let's.
All right, let's do that. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love hearing from you at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what's up this week?
We have a question from listener Eli from Mississauga who writes, "Hi, Steve and JMM. As both the son and brother of teachers, education is an issue close to my heart. I know Dalton McGuinty is often touted as the education premier, but has there ever been a premier in Ontario, or anywhere in Canada for that matter, who is actually a former teacher or educator? When I think of how school board trustees may not exist for much longer, we've talked about that on the podcast, I cannot help but think about how we might be better served with more people who have actual experience in schools with children being the ones making decisions that will affect them. Big fan of the pod. Keep it up. Best, Eli from Mississauga."
Okay, just off the top of my head, Kathleen Wynne, I think, was a teacher once upon a time. Mike Harris was a teacher once upon a time. Kathleen Wynne was also a trustee.
Yes.
Mike Harris was also a trustee. In fact, chair of the Nipissing School Board, as I recall.
Okay.
So there's two premiers, just off the top of my head, who were also teachers. Yeah. I know Bill Davis was not a teacher. He was an education minister, but he had kids who were teachers. Right. And yeah, I mean, we could go on, but there you go.
And I certainly, if anybody prior to Dalton McGuinty could fairly claim to be an education premier, Bill Davis would have to be on that list.
I think so. And, there's certainly been education ministers who went on to become premier, Bill Davis being one, John Robarts being one.
Yeah.
So that used to be and Kathleen Wynne, of course, a former education minister, went on to become premier. So that does happen.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting, you mentioned Kathleen Wynne and Mike Harris. I think I can say without fear of contradiction, had a wildly divergent effect on
think so,
the
do you?
education
You think
system.
so?
And so, as much as we want to talk about, and Eli is asking about, the effect of, if we can call it lived experience, in how people then apply their experiences to their time in politics, right? The reality is that your lived experience is just one part of what you bring to politics, right? Mike Harris also brought very different ideas about what the role of government should be,
and teacher unions, the role of teacher unions.
Yeah, and even the role of school boards, right? I mean, one of the things that the Harris government did that this current government is maybe continuing was they dramatically weakened the role of school boards, right? As school boards lost the ability to set their own tax rates, for example. Yep. They became functionally, part-time positions. There are people to this day who would tell you that they would want to see all of those changes reversed. But in 15 years in power, the Liberals, what I was saying earlier about, the structural changes that Mike Harris made to this province, right? In 15 years in power, the Liberals never really restored many of the powers of the school boards. They found a system, by no means did they only make cosmetic changes. We got full-day kindergarten as a for example, but as far as the powers of the school boards themselves, they were happy to let a lot of those changes stay in place.
Why don't you give the email address and we'll get out of here.
Right. Again, if you would like to ask about content on the show or ask about the professional backgrounds of premiers, you can please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, February 13th, 2026.
You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts so that you can get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it. Good, bad, or indifferent, as Prime Minister John Turner used to say. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced by Matthew O'Mara, editing by Colin Kish, additional camera work by Max Stussy.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is the vice president, programming and content.
We always love to give a shout out to our crew for the work they do to make the set look so nice. And boy, this studio absolutely looks gorgeous now. This is a few weeks in a row now. We've been in our new digs and we quite like it down here.
Really, it's nice to be back.
Absolutely. So until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.